Hey, welcome back to another great video. If you are new here, make sure to hit the subscribe button, the bell button, whatever other buttons you see on the screen. So today we are going to look into why you should use client-side input validation in JavaScript and what exactly does it mean, why is it important, and why you should care about it, right? Okay, so let me tell you a story. So this week, actually, I decided that I should go and refresh my memory about all different secure coding practices there are in the market, right? So as anybody, I Googled on the internet secure coding practices, and this is the first link that popped up. So you can see it's a checklist of secure coding practices presented to us by OWASP, right? OWASP is a big security company or foundation that works in with a lot of big conglomerates and holds a lot of conferences. So yeah, they are like key players in the industry. So you can see the first thing, the first item of the checklist is conduct all input validation on a trusted system. That is on server side, not client side. So now you would say, Apurv, then exactly what exactly are you saying? Should we do it on client side or should we not do it on client side? Okay. So let us dive deep into it to actually understand the trade-offs and see why actually I recommend you doing client side input validation with server side input validation. Cool. So let's first see what exactly does client side input validation means. Okay, so here input means a simple input box, right? So if you have visited a website and you are filling in your email, so the simple text box that appears, that is your input, right? Now what does input validation means? Input validation means making sure that correct input has been received and correct operations or actions have taken place. Now this is very important because of several reasons. If you don't do proper input validation, there's a possibility of SQL injection. There's a possibility of incorrect inputs, of course, right? There's a possibility of having a database error due to incorrect data type. There's a possibility of a backend error. If you're using a monolithic architecture, then it could lead to a big problem. So there are several reasons why you should do input validation. And of course, other logical reasons are also there. If you don't do proper input validation, finally, your code would be inefficient. You would have to handle a lot of cases. It would increase your work as a developer or engineer on the product. So it is not at all efficient to skip the input validation part. Cool. Now, why am I saying that we should do input validation on client side as well as server side? So let us first try to see what OWASP was trying to say, right? So OWASP was saying or recommending that we should do input validation on only server side. So basically how the flow would be, a client would come on client side application, he would fill in the input box and whatever he has filled in the input box would be sent through an API to server side, right? And then server side would further communicate with our database maybe. Yeah. So let us create a database out here with our database, right? So this was the usual flow that you very commonly see on any enterprise project, right? Why do we have a server here and why didn't client directly call the database? Because we use stuff like API keys, right? Or secrets or its other configuration details, right? So these information I wouldn't want to be exposed on my client side, right? I wouldn't want my clients or other malicious hackers to know what exactly are the API keys I'm using, what are different secrets that I'm using, or what encryption key do I have. So all this stuff is usually handled on server side, that is on our backend, which is again protected, but let's not dive into that. Okay, let's keep it simple that. Cool. So that is the reason why we have a server in between and we don't directly communicate to our database. Nice. Now, for the same reason of security, uh, the OWASP recommends that we should validate our input on server side because if you validate it on client side is prone to security vulnerabilities, right? So if somebody hacks into your client side code and is able to manipulate it or manipulate the input validation part, incorrect inputs would also be validated and be run and create operations on your database, on your cloud servers, or whichever important resource you have. Correct. So that is why the traditional approach tells you to take the input from client, send it to server, let the server validate it, and after validation, do whatever necessary operations are required, and then give back a response, of course. Cool. That is great and all, right? But now listen to me. What I want to say on the client side, what we can do is we can break down input validation in two parts. So the first part would only concern itself on what data type the input is coming in, what format the input is coming in, whether the input follows a particular pattern that we have, right? So the things that are related to the structure of the input and the value of, not really about the value of the input. Okay, so let me note down a few things that come at the top of my mind so that you get some idea about what I'm trying to say. So it can be about the validation about the data type. So for example, we have an input box that tells about a person's name, right? So such a input field should only accept alphabet input, right? It shouldn't include numbers, it shouldn't include punctuation, it shouldn't include special symbols, right? So that is called a data type validation, so that the information is in a particular format, a particular data type. Second that I can think of is format type of validation. So format, if you are an engineer already, you might know what regex is, right? So what do I mean by format? So for example, if you have an input box and it is for email, so you can make sure that it is in a particular format, such as there is some text, then there's an at the rate, then there's some text, then dot, and then com, right? So this is one format that you can validate. So for different types of inputs or different types of pattern, so or you can also call it a pattern. Actually, pattern would also be a right word too. So this is the second type of validation. Third is you can enforce the fields that need an input, right? So in order to do that, HTML, JavaScript, not Java, JavaScript as well, JSX and other stuff as well come with a field called required, right? So if you use it with your input type, then that that form would not be accepted until unless that particular input field is filled, right? So these are few types of validation that you can do. Few other types are also there where you can decide on the minimum and maximum value for a particular input. You can decide on minimum and maximum length of input on that particular input field. So these are just some basic types of input validation that you can do on client side. So I guess you get an idea that we are trying to do input validation on the structure of input rather than what value input has given, right? We are just trying to validate whether it is a legitimate possible input or not. Now once that verification is done on the client side, then we can go to server side, and there we can do some complex stuff, such as here you can verify whether the user who has given this input has access to whatever operation is being taken, or whether the person who is doing this operation based on the input is a legitimate user or not, and other complex applications, right? So now this is how we break down the basic input validation in two parts. Got it? Correct. Okay. You would also ask what other benefits does it bring by doing client-side input validation, introducing client-side input validation as compared to using only server-side input validation, right? So the one biggest benefit is user experience. So for example, you have a website, you have an input box. Now what used to happen that somebody would give incorrect input, then the input would go to server would validate it, then return a response. Then we would show on the screen, oh, okay, that your input is incorrect, please add something else, right? Now this whole process takes time, right? For it takes time to send a request to server, it takes time to get the request back from the server, it takes time for server to validate the particular input, correct? So what this used to create a loading screen, this used to break the user feedback flow as user has to wait for a response. Now if you keep all these basic validations out in at the client side, the user or the client immediately gets a feedback right on the client side without sending any request or without waiting for any response. Now once the basic validation is done here and he knows, okay, that the input has gone through these check boxes already, and then we can send the particular request to server side, which can then validate the input and then give a feedback if necessary, right? So this gives you a better user experience, gives you a quick user feedback, and makes the whole process organizable, smoother, and better for the user as well. Okay, so yep, I guess that was it. So we are down to our first item in the input validation checklist. We will go one by one through each of them in different videos and discuss them in very detail to exactly understand why these things are suggested, why these are not suggested, whether they are correct or incorrect, and come to a conclusion. So if you ask me, this particular condition, this particular recommendation is something that I would not say is correct. So yeah, see you in the next video. Make sure to subscribe, like, hit the bell icon, and bye.